Okay, and as you can see, our next panel, live panel, is ready and waiting to go. It's a session that we produced in partnership with Vigeo Eiris, and this session will highlight ways in which companies can rebuild a resilient supply chain through support and collaboration. On your screens, you can now see Keeran William-BEEHAREE, Executive Director, Market Access at Vigeo Eiris, and Carmel Giblin, President and CEO of ICTI Ethical Toy Program. It's live. They're here for 15 minutes, so we've got a bit to get through in that time, but hopefully it's enough time to get through some of your questions. So do use the Q&A box to the side of the stream. But now it's my pleasure to hand over to you, Carmel.
Thanks, Liam. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session, Rebuilding a Resilient Supply Chain Through Support and Collaboration. Over the next 15 minutes, I'll be talking to Keeran William-BEEHAREE of VE. First, let me introduce myself. As Liam says, my name is Carmel Giblin, and I am the CEO of ICTI Ethical Toy Program, IETP for short. IETP is the specialist labour standards programme for the global toy and entertainment industries. We work globally to provide assurance in regard to the welfare of workers in manufacturing. It is my pleasure to be in conversation with Keeran today. Keeran, perhaps you could just introduce yourself.
Sure thing, and good afternoon, everyone. Really great to be with you. I'm Keeran. I'm the Executive Director for Market Access here at Vigeo Eiris. We're an affiliate of the Moody's Corporation, specialized in ESG assessments. I've been working in the ESG space, as it were, for just over a decade now, passionate about responsible investment, social issues, very much tired of COVID-19, but again, happy to be with you all this afternoon.
Great. I think we'll certainly, a lot of people will feel the same, and we're all getting a bit tired of COVID-19, but great that we still have opportunities like this to come together. Before I get into specific questions, I'd like to just share maybe some context on this topic. Secure, stable, and flexible supply chains are critical to a company's success. In achieving supply chain stability and resilience, I believe many factors should be considered and understood. For us at IETP, we focus on the people producing goods. Without a stable and skilled production workforce, the entire supply chain is critically injured. Certainly, COVID-19 has presented many challenges to supply chains, and we'll hear a bit more about some of those from Keeran shortly. But I hope today will be useful to help you all understand how to protect and strengthen your supply chains for the future. So let's get into the conversation. Keeran, firstly, could you just explain a little bit or a brief overview of the work that VE does?
Yep, sure thing. So as I said in my introduction, we're an ESG rating agency. And since the 1980s, we've been providing ESG data, assessments, and services primarily for the investor communities in what has over time become a thriving and vibrant now global movement around responsible investment. Since the early part of this decade, we've moved into providing second-party opinions for sustainable bonds and sustainable loans as the sustainable finance market has taken off. And in short, as a corporation, our core mission is really to help empower people to make more better and more sustainable decisions.
That's great. I think probably obvious to lots of people what a rating agency does, but it's useful for us less informed maybe to have that understanding. And certainly, I think we might, as we get into the conversation, understand how you actually go about some of those taking a view on a company. But my first question really relates very much to COVID. So what have you seen the impact of COVID to businesses and individuals during kind of 2020 and the impact of COVID?
Sure thing. So I'd say to a great extent, COVID has really worked to reveal and to exacerbate a lot of weaknesses that were already there when it comes to sustainable supply chains. It certainly wasn't the beginning or the end of the challenges that corporations or investors face in tackling these issues. If you look back over the last 50 plus years, global supply chains have really served as an engine of growth, right? Allowing companies to act more efficiently, to scale up profits, also to reach new consumers in different parts of the world. And what we've seen, partly as a result of COVID, but really over a succession of events over time, is that shine that the concept of a global supply chain once had really began to tarnish a bit. That's partly been driven by what you would call ESG or ethical controversies. I can think back to events like the Rana Plaza collapse or the challenges around the Foxconn factories, but also as a result of international disruptive events. So you can cast your eyes back a little bit to the volcanic eruption in Iceland, but also then obviously what COVID-19 has done, which is certainly, categorized in that disruptive event. Now, thinking more specifically about ESG impacts of COVID-19, on our side as a rating agency, looking at the behaviors and the actions of thousands of companies, one of the things we've seen is an uptick in specific types of ESG controversy related to the supply chain. So one of the common ones has been concerns or criticisms over what you would call prompt payments, paying your suppliers on time. That's been a reflection of many companies looking understandably to protect their treasury in deeply uncertain times and hold off making payments until necessary, or in the worst case, really just trying to hold off any payments they might need. So that's one kind of ESG challenge that we've seen ticking upwards. Another one has been, again, a lot of corporations looking to break contracts with suppliers because they are unable effectively to operate in a business as usual scenario and sell whatever goods and services they might be taking because they cannot operate in the way that they would normally do so. And so, again, posing huge problems for smaller and less powerful suppliers when a major corporation is effectively saying, we can't really do anything with the services you provide, and we're looking to find a way to manage that situation. So in short, COVID-19, just a hugely disruptive force with a number of ESG impacts.
Keeran, I think what's really interesting about that is from a rating agency's perspective, obviously COVID-19 was not something anyone had planned for, and businesses have had to become quite reactive. Like you say, some of that behavior has put significant pressure on certain parts of the supply chain, so changes in payment terms, etc. Some of that actually required to survive for businesses, some of it possibly a bit more opportunistic. Within the work of a ratings agency, are you able to distinguish or put a judgment on the long-term impact of a short-term business decision? So, for example, if you're seeing some companies change their procurement terms now to manage COVID, would you take that into consideration for the long term as well as how that's affecting their business today?
So, in effect, I'll answer your question perhaps by turning it around and really speaking to what the purpose of an ESG assessment is, which is really to understand how companies are positioned to manage ESG risks and opportunities. And I think there's plenty of literature that talks to this. Many of these materialize over the long term. So the measurements that we produce, the scores that we produce are really looking at how companies are positioned to manage risks and opportunities that exist in their environment that are likely to materialize over the long term. Now, that's not always the case. And in many instances now, I think of agriculture and climate change. We're seeing a lot of ESG risks really materialize in the here and now. But on the whole, our measurements, what we're providing to investors is that view over how well a company is positioned for longer term success.
And I guess that probably brings me quite nicely to the next question, which is around, can you maybe talk to the limitations that you see in both the terms of corporate performance and research limitations? So what are the challenges maybe that you see in your work?
Sure. So I'll talk first about how we build an assessment and opinion in the first place on a company. So effectively, when it comes to supply chains, we're looking at three different dimensions: how a company is positioned to manage the labor standards in their supply chain, the environmental standards is the second dimension, and then we look at areas around the contractual setup that they have, so prompt payments and fair contracting approaches. And what we do is take kind of a three-dimensional view of what a company is reporting on, what their policies and commitments are, so where they're committed to go, what they disclose in terms of actions, audits, or training, so what they're actually doing, and then what the feedback from stakeholders actually is, what their KPIs are saying. If I think about the limitations that we see today in terms of performance, We see and have seen for some time no shortage of commitments on responsible supply chain management. There are very few companies out there that don't come out with some kind of policy explaining or articulating what their objectives are. But then when we look for the information around KPIs, what are your annual audits showing? That's very difficult for us to find as a rating agency. Effectively, companies are better explaining what they commit to do on the whole, as opposed to reporting it in a tangible way on what the actual results are. That is something that is changing slowly over time, partly as a result of improved reporting standards and pressure from investors, but effectively we see that gap. Now, talking to the limitations of our research, very, very clearly, very openly, what we cannot do as an agency is to go and audit on the ground. We're really looking at building our opinion, our assurance that we're giving to investors based on what is disclosed by companies. And so there is a very definite and real limit to what we can provide in terms of information in that regard.
Yeah, and I think we certainly from an ethical toy program perspective, we kind of echo that, which is often companies are just measuring their actions, not the impact of their actions. And we certainly would encourage people to really communicate the impact of what they're doing, not just that they're doing X amount of audits or whatever, but what are they actually learning from that? How's that implemented in their business strategy? So I think that's a really good point. Just on that kind of topic of trends and the impact of global supply chains, are there big trends that you've seen emerging over the last few years, or you see coming down the pipeline in the future that you'd like to share with people today?
Maybe 2 or 3 quick trends I would point to. So some of them are pre-COVID. I think before COVID, there was already a large reflection going on across corporates from different sectors about what a more sustainable and resilient supply chain setup looked like. And I think the overall perspective, at least anecdotally, was this this vision of a shorter, a more diversified or flexible, as you called it, supply chain with higher inventories that are perhaps not as cost efficient in the short term, but certainly more resilient, and in that sense, a better bet over the long term. I think alongside that, there's been a change in perspective, particularly amongst the investment community, about how to envisage the importance of supply chain departments and supply chains within a corporation and their value. So they're seen, I think, less as a mechanical or a tangential part of a company's success, and really being seen as integral to business performance. And I think that's translating into so much more investor interest on supply chain management and sustainability. So really what I'm saying is supply chains are trending away from being seen as a purely ESG or ethical consideration to being much more tied to responsible, sustainable, and real business performance. The last thing I'd point to is from again, going back to an ESG perspective, one of the perceptions that is also changing is this idea that supply chain problems happen in the far corners of the world. And there have been plenty of instances in recent history, and I think to the UK and to Boohoo this summer, really uncovering and revealing something that many people have known for a long time, which is that labor standards in general are weakening and have been for some time in developed economies as much as they are in developing economies.
Great. We've got quite a few questions to go through, so I'd suggest that I think we've only got about a minute left. So let me flick to some of these questions, and hopefully we can rattle through as many of these as we can within the time we've still got left. So firstly, Joseph would like to ask you actually it's just gone. Let me just 1 second. Sorry. Will your ESG ratings now be updated to reflect risks from future pandemics or certain businesses or industries?
Yeah, so we already, within a number of sectors, we look to understand how companies are positioned to integrate what we would call emerging risks or ESG risks. And they vary from pandemic risks to the physical impacts of climate change to cyber risks as well. So within an ESG rating now, compared to where we were maybe 10 years ago, there are many more dimensions of risk that are captured within our scores and measurements.
Great. One last quick one. There are more than this, and maybe Liam can pick up how we get answers back to some of the questions we're not able to answer while we're live. But just one quick one. Sorry, it's my timer. Oh, it's that one. Sorry. Just one quick one. Fairly simple question, maybe, but I'm sure one that we'd all like to answer. Where do you actually source ESG data from? Is it from focused public domain information? Are there certain places, certain indexes or public information sources that you would normally go to?
Sure. So, I mean, we have a team of around 250 analysts, and we're using information from the public domain, so information reported by companies, information provided to us now by a growing range of specialist tools that effectively pull information from the internet at a pretty extraordinary rate. And then we also have partnerships with a number of NGOs and civil society groups that also give us quite specialist information on specific sectors, and in some cases, specific companies as well. So it's a mix of self-reported data from companies as well as third-party information as well.
Great. Well, I don't want to run over any longer than we have already. Keeran, it was great to have this conversation with you. Clearly, it's an area that people have got a lot of interest in. So, so thank you very much. And Liam, we'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Carmel.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Carmel. Thank you, Keeran. Yes, we'll share the questions with you post in an email, and we'll try and get some answers to the other people that submitted. But yeah, take care, guys. Okay, those that joined us yesterday would have heard some exciting news and updates from P&G, and while we now have some further information and developments. Earlier this week, I was able to talk with Arta Litorowicz, the Senior Vice President, Hair Care Europe at P&G, and Yasmin Akpak, the Senior Director, Herbal Essences and Responsible Beauty at P&G, about the latest innovations, that announcement from yesterday, how they're going to address recycling and reuse efforts. So here's a discussion.